I would never have predicted of Hannad Hasan what he did on the 18th of May 2006, which was to stab Kian Prince through the heart, causing his death. The last thing I personally ever saw Kian do was to give a Year 8 girl, Pamela Moreira Peltre, a warm, loving big brother hug. This was at the end of the school day, about 20 minutes before he was fatally stabbed by Hannad, who didn't like it when Kian tried to break up the fight that he was having with someone just outside the school gates. Hannad was in Year 11, Kian was in Year 10. All the pupils loved Kian. He was friendly, funny, sociable, charismatic. What I didn't know until I read about it though, despite knowing both boys who were in different year groups, as I just mentioned, so weren't in any of the same lessons, was that Hannad was massively jealous of Kian on account of Kian's basically being a celebrity. And this was the case long before Kian got into the QPR youth team. Pupils loved Kian for Kian. The many, many bouquets of flowers that were laid for him at the school were subsequently converted into compost. And trust me, there were thousands of bouquets. Hannad was good at running, throwing and jumping. I remember being fed up one sports day of having to go and bring his javelin back every time it was his turn to throw it because I hated having to keep running so far. He was quite lazy in my lessons and could be distractive, but he was never aggressive or confrontational either towards me or towards any of his classmates. That said, you get pupils who behave one way with one teacher and another way entirely with another. Hannad apparently once did a piss in front of a teacher. Getting onto his more recent behaviour as a prisoner, he has very cowardly refused to meet with Kian's dad, Dr. Mark Prince, and keeping in mind my story about him doing a piss in front of a teacher, after serving his mandatory 15 years, he was denied parole on grounds of his having exposed himself to prison staff no fewer than half a dozen times over a 2-year period. Even if and when he does get out, he can get sent back inside any time for any length of time if he breaches any of the conditions of his release. Those conditions or rules being known collectively as a licence. He'll be on licence, bound to be sent back behind bars for breaking any of the rules that he'll have been told of, which will restrict certain areas of his life forever. That's what makes a life sentence, in case you didn't know. April the 20th, 2019, Stoke-on-Trent, England, early hours. A man is dialing 999 to notify the police of the young lad who the man has seen sitting on the bridge to the A500 with his legs dangling down. This is clearly worrying the man. It's now morning. A woman heads out of her flat, goes downstairs, walks out of the communal entrance, makes her way through the backyard towards the road, and wonders with terror why the keys to flat 6, which she's just picked up from the ground, are covered in blood. The block manager, to whom the woman has just presented the keys, wonders the same too. But of course, seeing the mangled, blood-spattered, naked body lying on the bed in flat 6, as the two women are now doing, both women now have two very different questions on their mind, as well as being overcome with overwhelming shock and terror. Who murdered the tenant of flat 6, an 18-year-old football coach, and why? 18-year-old Joseph Trevor, whose apparent attempt to jump to his death from the A500 bridge that came shortly after he took the life of Megan Newton and did a few other things to her as well, was thwarted by strangers, had never been taught boundaries, was accused of rape at the age of 15 and had an unnerving Jekyll and Hyde personality. Now, if I've got you hooked on this person's story so far, do subscribe, give the video a like, drop a comment when you're ready and donate. Hit the thanks button below, I'll appreciate you. In the early hours of the 20th of April 2019, Trevor, a semi-professional footballer with Newcastle Town, not to be confused with Newcastle United, who has all but won a scholarship for a footy training programme over in the USA, is stuck. He's been kicked out of the club that he went to with his friends for being in possession of ketamine. That's not counting the load that he's already swallowed. He doesn't want to go home because his parents will see that he's high on drugs and on drink. He's already been ordered home by the copper who, after the youth was booted out of the club, confiscated his ketamine from him at the police station, and now he just doesn't know what to do. This very sob story of his prompts a former school acquaintance of his, who he bumps into at the taxi rank where she and a friend of hers, who, like Trevor, have been out clubbing, are awaiting a ride, to offer him her sofa as somewhere to sleep until waking hours. The two were never really friends at school, and I don't know if this had anything to do with Trevor's unpredictable aggression, all bouncy and good-humoured one day, all moody and aggressive the next. But they always see each other around town and often run into each other at nightclubs. Stoke-on-Trent, you see, is a very, very small town. You can't avoid running into people you know on a frequent basis. It's near Crewe. You get to Crewe from Stoke on the A500 and back again. Both Trevor and this former school acquaintance of his also share a passion for footy and for sports in general. The acquaintance's name is Megan Newton, and given her playful mode of walking to her front door with Trevor after the taxi has dropped them off, it's clear that she's wholly unsuspecting of her companion, an old acquaintance from school who she's fairly familiar with and who she's just allowing to sleep on her sofa until later on that day when he'll leave. She 100% didn't deserve what Trevor did to her though, which was to get on top of her on the bed shortly after they entered her flat and strangle her for around 30 seconds to the point where she passed out. The perpetrator then got up, went to the kitchen, got a knife, then went back into the bedroom and then, as Megan lay face down, stabbed her all of 9 times in the back of the neck and in the back, with so much force that the blade went all the way through and penetrated both of her lungs. Megan was more than likely still alive before Trevor stabbed her, albeit that she was unconscious. At some point in the 90-minute, that is the length of a football game oddly enough, that Joseph was inside Megan's apartment, he forced himself on her. It's actually not clear whether he did that before or after getting busy on her with the knife from the kitchen, let's just say. It turns out that he violated her in 2 ways, and I can't risk falling foul of YouTube's content restrictions by naming the second of those 2 ways. Nothing came of the inquiry into the matter of why the police didn't keep Trevor in custody until his ketamine and his alcohol wore off, such as is normal police procedure. Had they done so, Megan's mother claimed, with good reason I'd say, Megan would still be alive today. It also infuriated Megan's parents to see that the perpetrator could be out at 40 if his application for parole at the end of his 21-year life sentence is successful, his sentencing having taken place in February 2020. While Trevor will be on the sex offender register for life, he has never shown any genuine remorse for what he did to Megan. Ooh, poor Megan and her poor family and friends. He hated white people, had parents who were scared of him, tried to behead one of his 3 victims, and will probably be in with the dress-wearing you-know-what-a-files in his new home, Belmarsh Prison, since if he gets on the wing, the white lads will fucking have him. Ha! But what were the missed opportunities to stop triple murderer Axel Rudakubana, who was 17 when, in July 2024, he committed his evil acts, becoming what he's become? Born in Cardiff on August 7, 2006, Axel Rudakubana grew up alongside his older brother in a modest home. In 2013, when Axel was 7, the family relocated to Banks, a small village in Lancashire, just a few miles away from Southport. The move was meant to provide the children with more opportunities and a quiet place in which to grow up. At first, Axel thrived in his new environment. He was liked by both teachers and classmates and rapidly showed his talent for acting, getting a role, in fact, in a Children in Need trailer where he portrayed Doctor Who. For a while, it seemed that Axel was heading towards a very promising future. By the time he entered adolescence, however, Axel's life took a notably dark turn. In 2019, at the age of 13, Axel started showing signs of deep anxiety and social isolation. He struggled to connect with his peers and increasingly withdrew from the world around him. His parents began to grow concerned. The shift was most apparent at school where, unlike before, Axel faced relentless bullying stemming from racial hate. That October, in a moment of desperation, Axel rang Childline and told them that he had started carrying a knife to school for protection. He said that he feared for his safety and believed that no one else would protect him and that he was seriously thinking about killing. When the school found out what Axel had told Childline, they kicked him out. On the morning of July the 29th, a few hours before he left his home, Axel sat at his computer and searched for details of the 2014 attack on Marie Emmanuel in Sydney, Australia. It was as if he needed one last dose of inspiration before enacting his own fucked cooked up plan. Shortly before noon, Axel stepped out of a taxi on Hart Street, Southport, ignoring the calls from the driver about how he wanted to pay his fare, the driver getting out of his taxi and following the customer for a few steps before giving up. And very possibly saving his own life with that very act. Who knows, innit? The perpetrator was wearing a green sweatshirt with the hood pulled up tightly and a surgical mask obscuring his face. Inside the Hart Street dance space, the Taylor Swift-themed dance lesson is in full swing. The girls, all aged between 6 and 9, are dancing with glee and delight under the coaching of their teacher, Leanne Lucas. Moments later, 3 of the very, very young attendees are lying dead on the floor of the studio in a pool of blood, while 8 others, including the teacher, collapse moments after that with stab wounds of their own. They have all just become victims of the savagery of 17-year-old Axel Rudakubana, who entered the studio shortly before wielding his 8-inch kitchen knife. And in case you need any further proof of this animal's total lack of remorse, when, shortly after enacting his murderous rampage, he was taken into police custody, he said, quote, "I'm so glad those K-bleep-DS are dead. It makes me happy," unquote. And sorry, I had to miss a word there in case YouTube restricts this video in some way. Word of the attack spread rapidly, plunging the whole nation into grief, shock and anger. This anger was about 10x'd when, within hours, false information about the perpetrator's background began to circulate online. These unsubstantiated rumours triggered a wave of protests and riots across the country, and even when it was established that the perpetrator was born and raised in the UK, people protested that his parents, who were Rwandan immigrants, should never have been allowed into the country. Having eventually pleaded guilty to all the charges against him, namely the murders of Alice de Silva Aguiar, Bebe King and Elsie Dot Stancombe, 10 charges of attempted murder and a charge of possessing a knife in a public place, as of the 23rd of January 2025, the perpetrator is doing a minimum of 52 years inside. According to the sentencing judge, the perpetrator is unlikely to ever be released, since a minimum term is just that, the bare minimum of prison time that a lifer has to serve. And again, if you are still in any doubt as to the perpetrator's heartlessness, he was kicked out of the courtroom twice for rudely shouting out and being disruptive. No remorse, no respect, just pure evil. Ha! Let him enjoy the coming 52 years in the company of friendly and supportive child rapists. See how he fucking likes that. On the 13th of November 2023, while hanging out with a friend in a park in Wolverhampton, West Midlands, 19-year-old Sean Cisahay crossed paths by pure coincidence with 2 12-year-old boys. Moments later, his heart was penetrated by a 17-inch long M-bleep CHETE, which had been plunged into his back by one of the 2 said boys. That STAB was, in fact, so forceful, penetrating Mr. Cisahay's upper body as it did by all of 23 centimetres, that the weapon very nearly came out the other side. The STAB to Mr. Cisahay's skull was, likewise, so violent that a piece of bone came away. Mr. Cisahay's legs were also hacked at. The bladed article, though, wasn't the only thing used on the victim in this thoroughly vicious attack. While one boy chopped away at Mr. Cisahay with the M-bleep CHETE, the other kicked, punched and stamped on the victim. Although CPR was subsequently administered to Mr. Cisahay at the scene, Mr. Cisahay never made it. Mr. Cisahay's friend had taken flight when, on seeing one of the boys get his M-bleep CHETE out, Mr. Cisahay himself had ordered him to flee. In court for their trial, which concluded in June 2024, the 2 boys were allowed to play with fidget spinner toys while giving evidence. They also sat in the main well of the court, rather say than in the dock or behind the bar table, like other defendants who were in custody. Sitting with them were both a family member and court intermediaries. These latter parties were there to explain the proceedings to the boys. The barristers and the judge didn't wear either wigs or gowns. At their sentencing hearing, which took place on the 27th of September 2024, the judge, Mrs. Justice Tipples, again didn't wear either her wig or her gown. Both boys got 8 years and 6 months. For each boy, this term was due to be reduced by the 315 days that, at the time of their sentencing, each had already spent in custody. But then in December 2024, each of those two killers had their sentence, 8.5 years, increased to 10 years at the Court of Appeal. However, they're both still going to be very young, 22 or 23, when they come out with their whole life ahead of them. A lot of people have clamoured that their sentences are way too lenient even now. Despite the fact that the two boys were convicted of MBLEEP RDER in June 2024, they still as yet can't be named. I'm calling boy 1 John and boy 2 Steve. What led up to this vicious unaliving, and why did John and Steve do it? The respective background of each boy may hold the answers. Sometime before the events of the 13th of November 2023, John had been referred to mental health services on account of his history of self-harm. His diagnosis of ADHD, Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder, came in 2022. His underdeveloped emotional literacy and his substantial lack of maturity are just two of his many complex needs. John's life had been an endless journey of change, loss and unpredictability, while domestic violence was an evil that he had suffered for many years. By the time of John's offence, he was being cared for entirely by his grandmother, the story of his parents being one that I simply can't trace. Most disturbingly of all, however, is that John was a victim of grooming, exploitation and modern slavery at the hands of older men in his local community. While he had no prior convictions, John was known to the police as someone who carried knives. As regards boy 2, who I'm calling Steve, like John, Steve had, before the events of the 13th of November 2023, suffered a notable level of instability in his life. His family had moved several times and had, at one point, stayed in a refuge. That, however, appears to be where the similarity between the two boys ends. Steve comes from a loving home with notably healthy family dynamics. He wasn't known to either police or social services and was, at one point, awarded the title of Student of the Year at his school. Having no mental health issues, his maturity level at the time of his offence was not below his chronological age. While the boy has shown remorse for his crimes, we're told, we're no less left with the question of what got into him on the night that he and John jointly unalived Mr. Cesar. I'm under the impression, in fact, that Steve is the one who shoulder-barged Mr. Cesar, as I'm about to detail, since he's described as being, quote, physically mature, unquote, which I personally take to mean quite tall and quite well built. What exactly unravelled on the 13th of November 2023 between John and Steve and their victim, a much-loved son and brother who had come over to the UK from Aguiar earlier that year to have his cataracts treated and to study? A month before committing the MBLEEP RDER, John bought a machete from a friend of his for £40. Given what we now know of John's background, this might well revile and disgust us, but it probably won't shock us, although of course it still could. We also don't know exactly why he bought the thing. In any event, having acquired it, he kept it hidden under his bed. On coming home from school on the 13th of November 2024, he changed out of his uniform and put on a tracksuit. It is likely that this is when he picked up his machete and snapped a picture of himself posing with it, and then sent that snap to a friend of his, a girl. This is something that he did a few hours before unaliving Mr. Cesar, you understand. Concealing his weapon, John then went out to meet a school friend of his, Steve. The two then met up with some other friends and headed to Stow Lawn playing fields, where they remained until after 8 p.m. Mr. Cesar and his friend, meanwhile, had, before the arrival of John, Steve and their friend, been hanging out at the same place. Their plans for Christmas had been what they chatted about while sitting on a bench in that place. Having gone away from there at around 8:15 p.m, they subsequently returned in the hope of sitting back on the bench. However, they found a group of school kids sitting there, 2 boys and 2 girls. Mr. Cesar asked the group to move. He may well have had no right to do so, but he hardly deserved the death penalty for doing so. One of the boys, who, as I say, I'm guessing was Steve, responded to Mr. Cesar by getting up and shoulder barging him. When Mr. Cesar asked the group what they were doing, one boy, who had to have been John I'd say, got his machete out. After performing, together with Steve, the acts that caused Mr. Cesar's unaliving, John went home with his weapon in tow and took the trouble of washing the weapon with bleach and then hiding it back under his bed. John and Steve were both arrested the very next day. Not since the shocking MBLEEP RDER of 2-year-old James Bolger in 1993 by 2 10-year-olds have we had in the UK an unaliving committed by individuals aged 12 or under.
Good evening. Within 24 hours of the conviction of the two 11-year-olds who murdered James Bulger, a row has broken out.
The James Bulger case horrified Britain. Robert Thompson and John Venables were 11 when they were convicted of murder. And the two boys who killed Sean are the youngest murderers since this case in 1993.
It is not known with certainty which of John and Steve dealt the fatal 23cm deep stab wound to Mr. Cesar Hay.
I'm sure from the nature of these injuries that the defendants intended to kill Sean. They acted together to do so, although I cannot be sure which one inflicted the fatal stab wound.
Having blamed each other for the unaliving, furthermore, the boys themselves offered no reliable testimony. We might all jump to the obvious conclusion and say it was John, but according to the judge, this was not proven beyond reasonable doubt. This means that, in reality, one of the two boys isn't an unaliver, but was no less found guilty of the offence of unaliving. I believe that the legal justification for convicting both boys of MBRDER, without determining which of them dealt the fatal blow, is that the boys shared both the physical act of unaliving and the intention to either unalive or cause serious harm. This principle comes from the case of the Crown versus Joggi 2016. Then again, wherever the legal principle involved comes from, there's a young man dead, never coming back. There's a family without their son and brother. There are people without a friend. Very sad. On the 2nd of July 2018, the body of 6-year-old Elsie MacPhail was found dumped in a wooded area within the grounds of a former hotel in the Isle of Bute in Scotland. Elisha's body was naked. To this day, Aaron Campbell, a former aspiring YouTuber who was just 16 when he abducted, raped and murdered Elisha, has shown no remorse whatsoever for his actions. Aaron Campbell was born on the 7th of May 2002 in Shrewsbury, Shropshire. The decision taken by Campbell's parents when Campbell was 4 or 5 to move to Bute sprang from a single key motivation. They wanted their two children, which includes Aaron and his younger sister, to grow up somewhere safe. In an additional irony, many of the numerous arguments that Aaron had with his mother as he grew up came from her drinking. His mother was an alcoholic. People who kill are often people who, as children, frequently got away with violence against others. Campbell appears to have got away with nearly drowning a girl by holding her head underwater when he was 6 or 7, and kicking another girl viciously and repeatedly when he was 10. If, as a child, Campbell also harmed cats, then this may offer a greater indication of his dislike, if any, for women and girls. Many men who kill women have a history of harming cats since, to those individuals, cats represent girls and women. I learned this from media psychologist Emma Kenny. As a total non-expert myself though, I am in no position to say whether Campbell's attacks on 2 girls as a child, coupled with his ugly relationship with his mother, served in any way to necessarily prefigure his sheer evil against any 6-year-old girls. When Campbell began self-harming, which may have been a manifestation of the depression that he suffered for a period, his mother was possibly too drunk to notice. Where Campbell's father was at this point, and what support, if any, he offered his son, I can't say. Despite his psychological issues, at Rothsay Academy, Campbell's secondary school, Campbell had lots of friends. He often went out drinking with them, whether at parties or elsewhere, his many friends enjoying his dark sense of humour. Campbell was a highly fit and active teenager. A keen gamer, Campbell posted videos to his YouTube channel showing him doing things like trampolining, alongside videos in which he duly played video games. Given Campbell's brand of humour, his friends may have taken it as a joke when, at 15, Campbell told them that he was considering doing something excessive, like rape. They may have reacted in the same way when, again at 15, Campbell said that he might kill one day for the lifetime experience. Neither comment was a joke, as we now know. But his savagery against Elisha was not, in fact, the first proof of this. Sometime after making those 2 comments, Campbell was made to undergo a rehabilitation programme after being caught starting fires. When, after Elisha's murder was publicised, Campbell's mother handed her CCTV footage showing the area outside her home to the police, she believed she was helping her son. The footage showed Campbell leaving and entering the house in the small hours of the 2nd of July 2018. However, having since quizzed her son over where he'd actually gone, his mother, Janet, was convinced of his innocence. In taking her CCTV footage to the police, she expected them to find the same. When, on the 4th of July 2018, Campbell was arrested for the murder, he answered no comment to every question. In the course of his trial, which began on the 11th of February 2019, having pleaded not guilty to Alicia's abduction and murder, Campbell logged a so-called special defence of incrimination. Campbell knew Alicia's father, Robert MacPhail, as well as Robert's girlfriend, Tony McLaughlin. According to Campbell, on the night of the murder, he and Tony had had sex in a garage. At some point afterwards, Tony had murdered Alicia and then planted Campbell's semen at the crime scene using the condom from her earlier sexual liaison with Campbell. Alicia's father thoroughly doted on his daughter, you see, and Tony was sick of playing second fiddle to her. On the night of the 1st of July 2018, Campbell had a house party in his large home with around 15 of his friends. The party ended at midnight, and a friend later recalled that Campbell seemed worryingly depressed. A short time later, Campbell sent messages round asking if anyone could sell him some cannabis. Having formally sold Campbell some cannabis, Alicia's father Robert and his girlfriend Tony both received Campbell's message. After getting no response, Campbell armed himself with a kitchen knife and walked the very short distance to the MacPhail property. On glimpsing Alicia sleeping in her room, which he did after gaining entry to the home via the unlocked front door, he instantly abandoned his plan to steal cannabis from the property. Instead, he answered the dark urges that the sight of this little girl sleeping awakened in him. As he later so bluntly put it, all I could think about was killing her once I saw her. Campbell lifted Alicia out of bed, exited the property and walked with her along the ocean shore. When he found Alicia waking up and asking him who he was, he answered that he was a friend of her father's and that he was taking her home. Once he got Alicia to the grounds of the abandoned hotel, he raped her and murdered her. I'm under the impression that Campbell raped Alicia both before and after killing her. He stated at some point, I believe, that it annoyed him to find that Alicia was actually still alive when he started raping her. Alicia's autopsy unearthed 117 injuries to Alicia's body. The injuries to her neck and face indicated that she'd been violently gripped. The injuries to her nose and mouth indicated that she'd been smothered. Her genitalia, meanwhile, sustained catastrophic injuries. The pathologist determined her cause of death to be significant forceful pressure to her neck and face. After finishing with Alicia, Campbell casually threw his clothes into the sea, went home for a shower, then returned to the murder scene to retrieve his phone. Between being found guilty by a unanimous verdict and returning to court some days later for his sentencing, Campbell confessed to Alicia's abduction and murder. He also declared that he was quite satisfied with the murder and that he had had to try very hard not to laugh during the trial. When passing sentence, the judge referenced these remarks of Campbell's and called Campbell a cold, calculating, remorseless and dangerous individual, completely lacking in victim empathy.
I have never before seen a police officer almost break down in the witness box, so affected was he by the sight. The contrast between them and you could not be more vivid. Your attitude was clearly demonstrated by the evidence that you posted an image of yourself in a mirror while making a joke that you had found where the murderer was hiding. The arrogance and callousness of that is breathtaking. Despite the overwhelming evidence against you, you did not plead guilty but elected to go to trial. That was your right, and I do not increase your sentence because of it. However, it is symptomatic of your staggering lack of remorse. Not once during the trial did I detect a flicker of emotion from you, and that was also the experience of the professionals who interviewed you for the purposes of the reports, to which I will turn shortly. Each of these reports contains clear admissions by you of your guilt. Not only that, and this is a terrible thing to say of one so young, but they paint a clear picture of a cold, callous, calculating, remorseless and dangerous individual.
On appeal, Campbell had his 27-year prison sentence reduced to 24. In late 2024, at the age of 22, he was transferred to an adult prison to serve the remainder of his sentence. And we all wish him absolute hell. Lindsay Birbeck was a 47-year-old mother from the UK. She had 2 children and lived in the small town of Accrington, Lancashire. She was known as a kind and caring person. She worked as a teaching assistant, and she was someone who loved spending time with her kids and enjoyed the simple things in life. And she was also into keep fit, which she normally did through walking or running. Just after 4 p.m. on the afternoon of the 12th of August 2019, Lindsay was last seen walking through a park, the Coppice, near her home. She'd gone for a walk in the Coppice, something something that she often did to clear her mind and, as I said, to get some exercise as well. But that afternoon, she didn't return home. Alarmed by her sudden disappearance, her family contacted the police. As the days passed, a massive search effort was launched to find Lindsay. The local community came together hoping for her safe return. 12 days later, however, the search was brought to an end. Lindsay's body was found naked in a shallow grave in Accrington Cemetery, the body being, by this point, in an advanced stage of decomposition, despite being wrapped in plastic. While the body was naked, police didn't find any evidence of sexual assault. Her cause of death was neck injuries. An extreme compressive force had been applied to her neck, which the pathologist said could have been caused by the act of stamping, kicking or kneeling. After killing Lindsay, the perpetrator had also attempted to cut off her right leg, possibly with a saw, in order, it's believed, to dismember the body. On reviewing CCTV that covered the area concerned, police rapidly put out a picture of a young male pulling a blue wheelie bin down Burnley Road, an act that the police found highly suspicious. 16-year-old Rocky Marciano Price, the mystery youth from the CCTV footage, who was named, as a lot of you will recognise, after a famous boxer, was actually brought to the police by his family. The police discovered that Rocky had walked to the coppice at around 2:30 p.m, but that there was no evidence of him carrying a weapon or that he was otherwise equipped to kill someone. When Lindsay, who had left her home just after 4 p.m, entered the coppice, another woman was hurriedly heading out of it via a different route. It turns out that Zoe Braithwaite, the woman in question, was running from Price himself because he'd seemed to be stalking her. Given what the youth did to Lindsay Birkbeck shortly after, I don't think we can be in any doubt that he was. The boy's attack on Lindsay was, by all accounts, swift and brutal, the perpetrator most likely having used his bare hands, along with acts of kicking or stamping or kneeling, remember, to kill her. After stripping his victim's body naked and then loading the body into the wheelie bin, wherever he pinched it from, he calmly made his way, with his victim's body in tow, to what became his dumping site, the cemetery. According to experts, doing certain things to a body after committing murder shows the murderer's desire to keep humiliating and defeating their victim even after they've killed their victim, and they do so in order to hold on to the feeling of power and dominance that psychopaths derive from taking another's life. This might be the explanation for Price's having stripped his victim's body, because remember, there was no evidence that the perpetrator did anything sexual with Lindsay. Meanwhile, leaving the body in a cemetery might have been a sick joke of the perpetrators, a way of saying to his victim's loved ones, "Here, I've done the woman's funeral for you, saved you a job." Price's was a crime of opportunity furthermore. His first target escaped him, so he simply lay in wait for someone else. And frankly, it would seem that, as I've already implied, he killed simply for fun. He's on the autism spectrum and his friends describe him as unemotional, but the judge, Mrs. Justice Yip, who in August 2020 gave the boy 16 years for murder, says those two attributes of his don't explain his actions. The perpetrator himself never revealed his motives, since he in fact denied committing the murder. All I can say is poor Lindsay, and the same for her family and friends.
What's your date of birth? You don't know. Stop being clever, right? You know how much bother you're in. Right. What's your date of birth? I can't read it right. But you know what your day of birthday is? No, I don't. Huh? I know nothing. You don't know anything? You don't know what day your birthday is? How old are you? 16. 16. Where are you from? Where'd you live? Where'd you live?
This police body cam footage is from the 27th of January 2023, and it shows a 16-year-old boy who has learning difficulties and is on the autism spectrum, who spent a whole hour on the evening of the said date stalking a trio of girls in Hexham, Northumberland, and who, only minutes before this video recording, stabbed 2 of the 3 girls, injuring one and killing the other. The other was 15-year-old Holly Newton, the former girlfriend of the boy, whose name is Logan MacPhail, and whose refusal to get back with her controlling bully of an ex-boyfriend has since cost her her very life. In the course of the 18-month relationship between Holly and MacPhail, the boy changed the passwords of all his girlfriend's social media accounts and constantly called her to find out where she was and what she was doing. Finding it impossible to believe that Holly really had meant it the last time she said their relationship was over, on the night of the 26th of January 2023, so the day before he committed murder, MacPhail had spent hours standing outside Holly's home, imploring Holly's younger brother to let him in. Finally seeing at 1 a.m. the following morning, so basically the day that he actually kills Holly, that nobody is letting him in, he departed. Here he is now in the late afternoon of the 27th of January 2023, crouching down to conceal himself as he spies on Holly, who is accompanied with two of her friends, in the supermarket car park. Here he is again, 20 or 30 yards behind Holly, whose turn towards his direction has prompted him to turn his own face away to avoid having her spot him, especially in case the face covering that he's wearing isn't enough to conceal his identity. When Holly agrees to follow him into an alleyway for a private chat, which she does when he openly approaches her at a bus stop, she has no idea what she's in for, not dreaming for a minute that her ex-boyfriend could ever be violent towards her. The citizen's arrest of MacPhail, performed by members of the public who intervened in MacPhail's ensuing attack on Holly, enabled the police to effect their arrest of the perpetrator only minutes after the attack. The 36 stabs that the perpetrator inflicted on Holly were so forceful that the kitchen knife that he used snapped. Holly's friend was able to stagger away and call for help when her own attempt to stop the attack failed, and she found the perpetrator stabbing her as well. As of late 2024, MacPhail is doing 17 years inside. Once again, we hope every second of every day feels like hell to him, and that continues to be the case if and when he ever gets out. Coming from just outside Newcastle, northeast England, and coming from a broken home, and in fact having very sadly lost his father at the age of 9, by the age of 17, Ewan Ireland had amassed as many as 31 criminal convictions. These convictions attest to the boy's markedly violent nature, while the boy's former neighbours themselves attest both to living in fear, such as they did all the while Ireland shared their street, and to having long since become sick and tired of the numerous police visits to the boy's home that they had seen over the years. Now, we don't necessarily know what Ireland had in mind when, around 6:15 p.m. on the 14th of August 2019, he nicked a screwdriver from Poundland in a local shopping centre, but we do know that shortly afterwards, he and a group of his friends were gathered near the entrance of the shopping centre, blatantly getting in people's way, but clearly not giving a shit. Even when 52-year-old lawyer and father of two, Peter Duncan, immediately apologises to Ireland for knocking into him as he does, and which is actually Ireland's own stupid fault for standing in such a stupid place, to remind you. Ireland no less immediately gets out the screwdriver that he stole a few minutes before and plunges it into Mr. Duncan's heart, Mr. Duncan and Ireland being complete strangers to one another. Ireland got 15 years for Mr. Duncan's murder, and in my opinion, like all the sentences that we've so far heard, that sentence is stupidly too short. On the 11th of February 2023, Brianna Jai, a 16-year-old British transgender girl, was murdered in a premeditated attack by Scarlett Jenkinson and Eddie Ratcliffe. After being lured into Colchester Linear Park in Warrington, northwest England, and that luring was done by Jenkinson, Jai was fatally stabbed. And it was also that Jenkinson and Ratcliffe could see whether Jai would scream like a boy or like a girl, given that she was transgender. Jenkinson and Ratcliffe were aged 15 at the time, and they were arrested the very day after the murder, and in December 2023 they were convicted of murder. Jenkinson got 22 years and Ratcliffe got 20 years, and in December 2024 he was denied permission to even appeal for a sentence reduction. Haha. The court decided that the offence was primarily motivated by sadistic tendencies, and that hate against transgender people was a secondary motivation of Ratcliffe. Honestly, this murder involved a significant degree of brutality and planning, and the evil that the two perpetrators spoke of with glee, delighting in what they were going to do, just looking forward to it, savouring it, and just being so happy when they did it. Honestly, that is something I will cover in a lot more detail in a separate video. On the 29th of March 2014, 33-year-old James Atfield, who had a brain injury and who was sleeping rough in a park bench, was stabbed to death in Colchester, Essex, that's South East England. 3 months later, on the 17th of June, Nahid Al-Manaya, a 31-year-old Saudi student of the University of Essex, was also stabbed and killed. The killer was 15-year-old James Fairweather, and he was apprehended while he was about to do a third murder. Some random woman spotted him lurking, just loitering around. I think he was near a bus stop or something, and she'd heard about the murders, and it just struck her that this guy was up to no good. She got the police on him and they nabbed him. So in January 2016, Fairweather pleaded responsible for both deaths. In April 2016, Fairweather was found guilty of both murders and he was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum of 27 years. Friends of 15-year-old Will Cornick knew that he was planning to kill his Spanish teacher, a lady called Anne Aguiar, but it looks like they didn't take it seriously or didn't think that it was worth reporting that to any teachers. But if they had, Anne Aguiar's murder could have been prevented. On the 28th of April 2014, the 61-year-old teacher, married, mother of two, just a few days or a few weeks away from retiring from the school that she had worked at her entire teaching career, which spanned, I think, nearly 40 years, just under. She was stabbed by, as I say, 15-year-old Will Cornick, and he stabbed her multiple times, about 7 times, at the school Corpus Christi Catholic College in Leeds. When he was interviewed about what he'd done afterwards, Will basically said that he just didn't care about the consequences. He hated his Spanish teacher. He'd wanted to drop the subject, but she wouldn't let him. Therefore, she had to die. He got a minimum of 20 years. In her diary, Sharon Carr wrote of her murder of 18-year-old Katie Ratcliffe, which he committed at age 12 in June 1992, that she really wanted to be able to kill her victim all over again. She wanted to make her suffer even harder the second time round, and that she swore she was born to kill. And it was indeed just for pleasure, sexual gratification in fact, that Carr actually killed Katie. There was no other reason for it. Carr might actually have got away with the murder of Katie Ratcliffe if it hadn't been for her attack on a pupil at her school who she stabbed for no reason whatsoever except pleasure. And then afterwards she was of course taken into custody, and at that point she started boasting about what she'd done to Katie Ratcliffe, and that is how she got caught. She caught herself out with her stupid big mouth. Serves her right. Now, even though she's been in prison, she hasn't changed, and in fact she's a restricted status prisoner, and she's regularly attacked other prisoners and prison staff, and she's regularly expressed her desire to kill others. And at the last parole hearing that she had, which was in September 2022, she was denied parole. Haha. She's been banged up now since 1994, and she was convicted of Katie Ratcliffe's murder in 1997. And frankly, I think prison is too good for her. If you've enjoyed this video, I recommend you to watch this one next. I'll meet you there.